Hello, everybody. Welcome also to the virtual audience. I first of all want to thank Evelyn and Gergely and also the Greek partners for this wonderful event and also for giving me the opportunity to speak here. And that looks weird. That's okay. And yeah, Evelyn already mentioned it. I wrote my PhD thesis about tourism in German wine regions with Gergely, and it was quite great and also quite successful, I think, in terms of outcome and everything that developed out of it. But as usual, things don't last forever, and at some point it was over. And then, fortunately, a new project came up, which was about promoting biodiversity in all German wine regions, which was also great. And I'm very happy to be in this big 6-year-long project that includes all 13 German wine regions. But also I was kind of sad because I had to leave the wine tourism field. And then, fortunately, as it turns out, there are big intersections and big interplays. So I'm very happy that I can go on with my tourism studies and combine these two research fields, which will be now also, I guess, a little something that makes me special in terms of research because it's a very niche topic. Okay, so biodiversity in wine tourism, a happy marriage. Let's put a little question mark on the end. I want to start with the question of what is actually wine tourism. It is not that easy to say. There are actually many different types of wine tourism, and it's not that easy to grasp. It's all about the experience, but the experiences can be quite different. If you ask experts and scientists, you see the World Tourism Organization says it's part of gastronomy tourism. Hall, one of the most cited researchers on the world in terms of tourism and in terms of wine tourism, says it's part of food tourism. You have part of culinary tourism and gourmet tourism. Sometimes it's also heritage tourism, which is important to mention, but usually the argument goes towards, okay, it's part of the wine and food experience that comes together. Now I want to show you a little result from my PhD thesis and from our studies here in Germany. When you ask not wine tourists only, but tourists to German wine regions in general, why did you come visit this region? The most important point is actually nature or the landscape. Second point is relaxation, and then comes the wine, and then the pleasure of combining wine with food. Now, when you look at the differences between wine tourists and other tourist segments, you see there are actually two main differences. Of course, the wine is more important, which becomes motivation number one, which is important. If you are a wine tourist, then your motivation number one should be wine, right? And then you also see that the pleasure of pairing wine with food is also significantly more important to the wine tourist than compared to other tourist segments, which actually is the most significant difference in this case. But what you can also see is, yes, food and wine plays an important role, but actually the landscape is still more important than the food component. And this is something where I want to build up on and jump into the landscape side of things. Actually, this is also not completely new. There are many researchers, such as Joan Brewer, that have said the most important characteristic of the entire winescape is actually the region's scenic beauty. And there are other authors that have concluded the same thing. But it seems that the special part of the landscape is still not as popular as the wine and food combination, which of course is important, and it lies in the integral combination of the cultural givens that are the combination that wine culture goes together with food. So, but now back to the landscape. the question is, what is actually the interplay between the wine growing, between the landscape, and between the tourism? How do they affect each other? And of course, you can see that the landscape, because of geological components, etc., plays an important role for viticulture. On the other hand, you can also have a big impact of viticulture on the landscape itself, which I will show you in a little bit. And then, long story short, we also wrote a book chapter now about this, which got accepted and will soon be published next year. We actually found, due to a literature analysis, that viticulture strongly affects the landscape strongly affects the tourism, and tourism strongly affects the wine growing part, which creates a kind of circle which benefits all aspects of this triangle here. But of course, there are many different types of landscapes. So how do you start talking about, okay, the landscape is an important part. Okay, but what kind of landscape? That's a big question, and that is actually not very easy to answer. You have here your traditional historic landscape in the Douro Valley on the down left corner, but one above is Stellenbosch, which is not so traditional and which looks more like a picture from Lion King than a traditional German wine regions, right? Also, a very important part is landscapes change, especially agricultural landscapes, and especially in Europe. Traditionally, you have had fields on the left side here that are very small, very strict, structurally disadvantaged. I don't know if you see all the black dots, they are all trees. And if you look at the right side, there's basically no tree left. And what you also see is the fields have gotten bigger due to agricultural intensification. In this case, it's wine growing. So the small fields came together so that the businesses could actually have the wineries could actually run a more profitable business. What they didn't see is that these landscape changes actually affected the landscape image so much that it was not very beneficiary in terms of how do people perceive this landscape. It's actually, and that plays a big role in terms of identity creation for the local population. You usually identify yourself with the landscape you come from. If the landscape swifts so strongly, it has an effect on you, on your identity, and also for the attraction of tourists. It plays a big role. Now, with this, also the structural heterogeneity got lost, and of course, animals and plants lost their habitats. And this brings me to the next topic of biodiversity. So now the other side. What is actually biodiversity? Biodiversity has three components: the genetic, the species, and the ecosystem level. The ecosystem level is, or let's start with the species. You have your different plants and animals. You have your subspecies, your genetic differences within the species. And then you have your ecosystem diversity, which, if you look at our landscape, means you have different kinds of landscape elements that form a whole. Now, coming back to the wine landscape. On the left side, you have an intensified field, let's say. And on the right side, you have a structurally rich wine landscape. And it is important because this topic has come up much in the last years, because agricultural intensification is actually one of the main drivers for the loss of biodiversity around the world. Meaning, okay, for the production, for the business side, it's good, but plants die and animals die, and it's a big thing. You don't get them back. And they say COVID is actually a result of the loss of this biodiversity, which makes the complete ecosystem of the world unstable and allows these kind of diseases to spread. So now agriculture tries to go a little bit back from that. don't intensify so much, but come back and create a structurally more rich field, which is interesting also because the organic production has had a big come up, and organic production has actually a good impact on biodiversity. On the other side, if you look at these two images, you could not tell if this is organic or not. On both sides, you couldn't tell. So in terms of biodiversity, it doesn't actually make that big of a difference, but the structure of the landscape is actually way more important than the production method itself. Now, here you have two, let's say, paintings. On the left side, you have a monotone landscape. On the right side, you have biodiversity elements in the landscapes. You have your, was heißt Begrünung? Greening. You have your greening within the, no, what?
Greenery.
Greenery. You have your greenery in between the rows, but also you have trees, you have stone, you have hedges, you have dead wood, very important for microorganisms and such. And also sometimes vineyards, especially in Europe, go together like this, like a triangle. And they are very hard to maintain, and it doesn't really make sense. So these parts you could take out, like here, and put something that is actually more impactful. Now, there are many questions that arise from this. For example, who takes care of these things? Is it the wine growers? So if the wine growers take care of this, don't they go away from their traditional business of producing grapes and selling grapes or wine to the customers? No, they also have to put on landscaping gloves, let's say, and work in the fields which surpasses their traditional task. But the other point I want to stretch here is, what effect does it actually have on the landscape, on the character of the landscape? So, and which is actually more appealing, which has a higher aesthetic value for the population, etc., and which plays a bigger role in attracting tourists. In the wine field, there's actually not much research on this. But if you look at the agricultural field, you see that structurally rich landscapes are more aesthetic and also more appealing and attracting for tourists. Also, of course, when you look at the landscape aesthetics, it's important to look at the historic value. There are historical landscapes that play a big role for attracting tourists. And these landscapes are often very important for biodiversity. If you look at these, they are structurally rich. They have stone walls. There can be lizards in there and all kinds of plants that are important food for other animals. And so the problem with these vineyards is they're getting less and less profitable. You can't make money with them. People don't pay the price. You have to pay, if you want to be profitable, you have to charge like 100 euros per bottle if you want to be serious about this. In some cases, if you look at the right side, it's probably the case. Maybe, let's say 70, 80, but to make it profitable, you have to charge a whole lot. So who pays that? No one. So what happens to these vineyards? They get lost. Actually, there are big parts that are now, and also UNESCO heritage regions like the Middle Rhine area here around the corner of the Rheingau, they have the UNESCO status to preserve the landscape. And what happens? They get lost. There are just trees and woods there. And it seems like they don't really care. I mean, the UNESCO status is still there. So I'm wondering, okay, what is it actually for? But that's another topic. Let's come to this. These areas, these landscapes are important for tourist attractions, for identity building, and also for biodiversity, for plants and species that live there and that would otherwise die and maybe not come back. Coming to the topic of tourism and biodiversity a little further. Now I'm coming to the point of this presentation. It's actually not a big woe, or no one did it actually before. It is actually pretty clear. There are big intersections between tourism and biodiversity, as this publication of the World Tourism Organization shows, which has the title Achieving Common Goals Towards Sustainability. Sustainability, we've heard it today and you hear it all the time. It is the topic, and combining these two topics of tourism and biodiversity goes actually hand in hand if you want to foster that. And the landscape level in the wine business plays the major role in terms of wine regions, of course. Good. Now is where I want to show you a little bit what we have done. I mean, I showed you this triangle. We took a look at the interactions between landscape, wine growing, and tourism. And we will also look into the point of landscape aesthetics in terms of focus groups that we will conduct later on this year. But right now, the first study that we did, Gergely, I, and colleagues from my new institute, is how do wine growers see it? Do they actually know that how important the landscape is for tourism? And what role does the vineyard play in it? These are the first two questions that we asked before we went on to the biodiversity question. And this is the result. Oh, by the way, we interviewed 52 wineries qualitatively, 4 in each German wine regions, and we took emphasis on selecting them to be as representative for the region as possible. So we selected them in accordance with regional experts, different company sizes and different company forms. Thanks. Okay, here's the result. What is the role of the landscape? They say it's the decisive role. It's the most important role. Wine growers know how important it is. They are actually pretty aware. So what do they also say? They say it's important to preserve it. If we want to keep attracting the tourist, then we have to preserve our landscape. And it has to be maintained. If you don't take care of it, then it becomes bushy, as I told you earlier. The character of the landscape gets lost, and so on. So what role does the vineyard play in this landscape from the winery perspective here in Germany? They say it's of very high relevance. They say it's the landscaping shaping element. It's the element that gives a wine region its face. It's the reason why a wine region becomes a wine region, is the wine landscape, in their opinion. And also, it is an important marketing tool if you want to attract tourists and if you want to, if you want to attract tourists. It's funny because I looked at some pictures, and you saw some pictures earlier. And when you Google wine tourism experience, usually they're landscapes. I mean, it's crazy. You have your tasting rooms, you have your restaurants, you have your whatever. But if you Google wine tourism, usually the landscape comes. That shows you the importance, actually. Awesome. Which is a very important point, is they see themselves as in the role of landscapers, not just the grape producers. And there's actually a study that has been conducted in the Mosel Valley this year, which shows that 96% of all wine growers in the Mosel Valley see themselves also as landscapers. 96%. That's crazy. And they don't get money for it. They don't get paid for it. They do it. Why? No one knows. Why do they do it? It's actually not quite answered yet. And it's also interesting because I don't know if you've heard that, but this year German wine culture was officially introduced into UNESCO heritage. German wine culture is officially UNESCO heritage. That's great. Still, what do they say? What does UNESCO say on their homepage? They say it's also because of the preservation of the cultural landscapes and to give validation to the wine growers that take care of it. And they say it is in the responsibility of the wine growers to preserve these landscapes. It's crazy. I mean, it's nice that they want to give these thanks to the wine growers, but yeah, okay, maybe from a warm handshake they can't buy their kids food or whatever, you know. They don't get paid for it, they do it. Why? There's actually no real reason, it's weird. So, important topic. So they see themselves as landscapers, and they say especially the traditional ones are the ones that attract most tourists in the winery perspective. Now coming to the final question and to the key question, and I only want to have these, we only have these results from a winery perspective, which is important to mention. And I emphasized on the beginning that there's a question mark. There's not one simple answer. If it is a happy marriage or not, I guess there are different kind of marriages, you know. So is there an interplay of biodiversity in German wine regions, and how does it look like? Most of the people that we ask say yes. There is a definite interplay. So how does it look like? They say biodiverse, complex, diverse, whatever you want to call them, structurally diverse landscapes are more appealing to visitors. They also says it's a kind of zeitgeist. You have young people going on the streets, putting Friday for Future on the radar of the whole society, not just the young people, and they change the mindset of the whole society. And people talk about it. People talk about sustainability. People talk about the biodiversity laws and how can we cope with it? How can we stop climate change? It's a big thing in the media, and therefore this topic has become very, very relevant. And one of the most important things, perhaps, viticulture offers great potential for fostering biodiversity. Why? Because you have your firm structures, you have your rows, you have everything that is there. You don't harvest it, then put another crop there and switch it up, like many other agricultural production does. But we have our firm structures, and we have the possibility to create permanent elements for fostering that. That's what they say. The other side says, no, they say they just don't see it. Why should it matter? They don't see it. Okay, maybe it is important to that people who say, yes, there is a link, they also say they don't think people realize it effectively, but it is a subconscious thing. And they argue a little bit in the same, but they more or less say, no, they don't see it. They say other reasons are more important. Why people visit German wine regions in this case, which is a valuable point, I think. It's not just one reason, there are several reasons, and it's very, very hard to pin them down. And the last point they say is accurate is better. So if you have everything clean, it is better, and it's actually more beneficial for tourists. So in the end, you have your question mark, don't have a yes or no. It leans towards yes, and I'm still confident that it is important also for wine tourism. Let's see what the research says in a couple of years. And I wanted to say one last thing. What was it?
Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Thank you for your attention. And,